right, so we're back with part 2 of book 3, Mere Christianity. Been discussing the book, misconceptions as people may have as Christians and non-Christians. That's how I found it very fascinating. If you want to go back and see some of the other videos from the previous books or chapters, or read along with us for the next few. Right now, this one's book 3, part 2, because book 3 was a longer one. And let's get started with, you said the first chapter was forgiveness, but I didn't write anything down in that one. And it was mostly because it was a pretty short chapter. And this one, it just explains what forgiveness is and love thy neighbor, and kind of clears up a little bit as to what all that means, because I think that's one of those other misconceptions that one of those misconceptions that I guess says, or it makes you think loving thy neighbor, even if like they're a kind of a bad person or whatever, that you would still want to, it's not kind of what you may think it means, and it's pretty much treating them as you would treat yourself, and pretty much kind of, I guess, cut them some slack. If you were to do those same mistakes at your neighbor, and by neighbor it's not in a literal term, but just anybody, those people around you, then you would want to cut yourself some slack, because like, oh, I'm going through a lot, or I'm going through this, or blah blah blah. And that's in the sense that it tries to describe it, that cut the person some slack, wish them well, wish them that they can do good and find the energy or whatever you want it to mean for them to have, I guess, a better positive outcome.
If I remember correctly, it also says something to the sort of, they might not be, like, to try to separate them being a bad person. Like, maybe they're not a bad person, but their actions are unfavorable. So dislike the actions and not the person. That's
right. I did forget about that one too. So that's pretty much it for the forgiveness part. It was for a relatively short chapter, and that's pretty much what it was trying to get at. The next part is the great sin, and this one was very fascinating because it did mention back in the sexual morality one that sexual sins aren't as big a culprit as this one is. He's like, sexual morality is still very part of your instinctual side, and so there's, not that you're not in control, but there's still a little more, I guess, instinctual, that makes it more, I guess,
forgivable.
Well, still, I guess, somewhat out of your control. But the great sin is pride, and this one is the greater sin in this sense, because it is pretty much completely within your own abilities. So you're totally manufacturing all these things. It's not as, maybe it is like psychological or whatever, but it's still very much something that you can more easily feed into it, and it's still way more, it's not as, it doesn't seem as instinctual. So I guess pride compares it to, says it's competitive by nature, meaning if you want to be richer than the next person, be better looking, or just better off than the next person, it can create a very competitive sort of state that, I guess, in this sense, it says is what the great sin is. So I guess apparently it's incorrect. Anything you want to add to that so far?
So at the beginning of this whole section, I was like, oh my God, I'm a prideful person. And I was thinking like really terribly of myself for the great sin. And then at the very end, it wraps it up really nicely. And then I ended up feeling a lot better. Of course, there's different things that you can always work on, right? As a person. But it was I don't know. I feel like this is like really, really summarized what you just gave.
Yeah.
Um,
Is that too like too summarized or like
yeah,
too
but
short? Or
yes, but it's hard for me to remember all of it. It was really like, I guess he just goes into each of those sections, right?
there's a few other notes I wrote down here. So it says, um, he goes on to say that prideful people are essentially worshiping an imaginary god, and he's talking about people that kind of do this, have this mentality, like, oh, I'm like kind of look at me, look at all my accomplishments, look what I've done, and like, and I guess to me it still came off as the ones that are like talking down about another person, but still says it with like a Christian intent, like look at how Christian I am, and like look at all the things I've done, look at all the things I've accomplished, and I can, and that's what he goes on to describe, that this is worshiping an imaginary god. This is not what God intends for you to act in this way.
Right, but and then he does say like that being proud of what you've done or how far you've come or what the things that you've overcome is not
No,
the same as being not as the same as the great sin, right?
it's
Not
more
as
as a
pride.
comparison that is the sin. So you're trying to make yourself look better than another person versus, I guess, like in more psychological terms, I hear it more, to not compare yourself to others, but compare yourself to your past self. So have you gotten better at this? Have you overcome that? And so on and so on. And so I think in that sense, it kind of makes sense in that same way, where you compare yourself to yourself, but not compare yourself to others.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and again, pride, I think, gets confused. I remember this one being a thing. I remember back in high school, I would hear one of my a classmate had mentioned this. He was already very anti-religion, and at that point, I was a little more into it. And he was like, "Well, yeah, being proud of an accomplishment is a sin," and I think he was taking it from this being prideful, and it's not the same thing. The pride has two different meanings, and so you can be proud of your accomplishments, but to be proud of your accomplishments over someone else's, I think that's where the difference is. This next one is the one I took a harder hit, and it was not caring about what others think. And I think I do care what certain people think of me, but the majority is also not. It goes on to mention something like who is this person to tell me what, and I guess that's part of my mentality, and I don't know if that's that's a misunderstanding still how this is explaining it or not, but that one is for sure one of my hardest ones. Like, kind of, who are you to tell me what, if this is good or not? Like, I don't know you. I don't. Why am I supposed to care? But certain people around me, I do care, but at the same time, there's a part of me that doesn't, because it's still a very internal, I guess, conflict within all of us. Like, well, you don't quite know exactly how I'm going through this, what I'm going through, and so with whatever what if this is my best, I guess, and so I don't know. It's that this has probably been the most, even upon the fourth time reading this, the hardest one to accept for me.
And so aside from how it affects you when it's just written generally for Christians, what is it supposed to be? So if you don't care what others think, that's a sign of quote unquote pridefulness, right? You should care what people think of the things that you are doing, correct?
Correct. And I guess it goes back to that, like the three ships morality thing, because it's still whatever you're doing as your ship may be affecting somebody else's ship. And I guess in this whole thing, if that's the overall goal, to progress Christianity as a whole, and if you're not doing it, if somebody's trying to help you and give you criticism, and it's not, I don't know, I guess that's the way I'm interpreting it, is that it's help, but I guess you don't want help. And maybe that's one of my things too, is sometimes I don't want help because it's not going to be the help how I would want it. Like it's not going to, I guess I already understand a good chunk of myself, and whenever you try to help, it's not helping in the way that I would have. I feel like it would benefit me the most in that certain way. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know if you have anything else to add to this one.
No, I felt pretty okay with it. It didn't bother me significantly. I think that constructive criticism, my first degree was in musical theater. That's all they do is criticize everything. Every ounce of you is criticized. The way that you say a word, the way that not necessarily criticized, right?
Yeah.
But it's their vision. You have to be malleable, and I think that I'm an extremely malleable person. So when it's that, do I care exactly what people think of me? Not in all instances. If it's for a certain outcome, if I'm working with a company and they say, hey, I need you to do this, this is what you're doing, and this is how we want it, then I'm like, oh, okay, and I'm able to accept that constructive criticism. Now, if it's just being critical about the way you look or the way you, whatever, something superficial, then get the hell out of here. That's different. Than having some kind of constructive criticism for a business or for the better good of a company or the better good of a like a cohesive thing that you're working with other people with. Then I think that that's fair, right? And I don't have a problem with that.
No, and I don't think I have a problem with that either. It's more, I do mention, I had like, when I have mentioned to you before that I think it's important for everyone to be able to know when to be a leader and when to be a follower. Like, I think a lot of times we put too much emphasis on being a leader. Like, oh, you want to grow up and be a leader. And I was like, yes and no. I think you can't all be leaders. So if you're telling everyone to be a leader, then what's going to be a huge group of just leaders? Everyone's going to just be wanting to go one way and not the other. And so you also have to know when to be a follower, even if you have leadership qualities. Like, oh, I think I could do this better, but it's not my turn right now. So let's see what this person has to do or has to say or their ideas and go along with their ideas. And I think that's also
definitely the hardest part for me, taking the back seat on projects. I can't stand it. Like, I've always had leadership qualities. And so when I have to take the back seat, I'm like, okay. And then I that's where my pridefulness used to come into play. I used to be very judgy. I'm like, you think that you're going to be the leader? You better be the best damn leader. Because if you're going to have me follow, you better step it up. Because I can do it. I thought I can do it better. Right? And so those are things that I'm personally working with. Like the pridefulness would definitely come in that. The confidence to move a situation along, I could do that. And so taking the back seat, yeah, definitely my pridefulness is challenged there.
And mine on that is, I think experience is the best teacher. And so I don't want it to come off as like sounding prideful also, but sometimes for somebody's, if you kind of have an idea or feeling that this idea isn't going to work, like the best way to do it is just to let them experience it. Like, okay, let's just go. Let's do it. Do your idea. And then you realize like, oh, maybe we didn't account for this. And like that's the part that like, okay. And it's much faster to just let them do that than to try to convince them otherwise. Like, okay, let's just get this done. Go for it. You try your way. All right. Didn't work. Let's try something else.
It was so difficult in grad school with that. Because I would let them attempt that. And then at the very last day, who was doing all of the work? And so it ended up messing. No. And that's how come with that experience, it even more so. I'm like, all right, if we're going to do this, let's do it. Let's do it the right way. And as soon as I see them tripping, then I'm sorry. The alpha has to come out of that. There are certain instances where, yes, right, if you have that leeway, you have that playtime, and you know that you're going to be able to clean up their mess afterwards, okay. if you have that time. But when you don't have that time in grad school, when they give you a big project and you have a week to complete this, and they start tripping on the third, fourth day, how many days does that leave you to complete the project for them? Scoot over.
Yeah.
So there are different instances where I think that pridefulness and the care of what people think and like all of that comes into play. It's situational.
Yeah, and I guess even to me, I like playing the long game. So even if this time didn't work, hopefully for the next time, they now understood, and then the next time it will be faster.
Well, there's some people though.
And yeah, and some people
I
have
have somebody like in my mind that I kept getting put in the same group because the projects came out so good, and I'm like, this person always wanted to be the leader, and I'm like, okay, you can try, but after the second or third time, I just went to the professor and I was like, no, I'm not gonna be in that group. I can't either. I'm gonna be in the group and I'm gonna lead it, or I'm not gonna be in the group because I'm doing all the work. Like, I expect to get all of the recognition then. Talk about being prideful. Yeah.
Well,
but when you're doing the entire project for a group,
yeah, and I guess these are the things that I guess we can judge each other all day about, but apparently it's only going to come down to somebody or some other entity judging us on whatever.
that's
whatever
what it said.
happened.
Yeah, that's what it said in some of the other chapters. What was it? The chapter before this.
Yeah.
It said that's why Christians are taught not to judge, right?
Yeah.
No, that one, it's situational, I think.
All right. The next one is charity. And I wanted to explain also that charity is not what it means today. It is like helping the less fortunate. And in this sense, it said it used to mean love but in the Christian sense, which pretty much meant the same way as like what we talked about forgiveness, wishing people good and treating them as you would treat yourself. So again, giving them benefit of the doubt for the not so good stuff that they do or whatever, at least in our eyes, if just kind of cut them some slack. And that's kind of what charity meant. Act as if you love your neighbor. And I do think this is kind of like one of those psychology tricks that they say, like, if you just keep doing certain things, you kind of trick your brain into believing these things. So act as if you love your neighbor, and eventually you kind of will love your neighbor.
I thought of something with that, and then going back to the like blending into the next one is another way to go about it. Maybe would be to teach the person the leadership qualities or how to get things done. True. Rather than just being like, move the hell over.
Yeah.
Right? Like maybe teaching them
the less prideful way to
maybe using charity and loving them. Like, just because they're not doing a good job doesn't mean that you don't like that person, right?
Correct.
It means that you don't like what they're doing. And so you're going to try to modify those behaviors by acts of charity.
And yeah, and I guess through the whole grad school stuff, like me as a teacher, I know experience is the best teacher, and I think that's one of the reasons I still find it the most, because even if you're going to teach them through experience, like let them go through, I think part of that is failing. But that's one of the reasons I hated group projects in college too, is because it's everyone at stake for kind of one thing or whatever. Like there's too many people involved, and one bad decision could kind of ruin the whole thing. And I don't think that's quite fair. And yeah, even in this book, it already talked about fairness and whatever. It's not always going to be fair and blah, blah, blah. But I think there's a little more at stake that is within our control. Like if the teachers are putting you in group projects, that is within your control. This was your decision to be in group projects. And if you're trying to teach a life lesson that in life or work, you're going to have to be in group situations. But there's still a little more that can be done to get yourself, well, at least there's more of a consequence if something happens, or if somebody's not pulling their weight, you can kind of go above or something and tell like, hey, like, I know this was a good intention, but so and so's not pulling their weight, and it's kind of compromising the whole project. And I don't know. I think there's too much at stake in college, because now if you fail this class, it's likely that you either have to take it again like a full year later. Sometimes when they don't have the class just like next semester, it's not something you can just redo again for the next week. And so there's different scenarios like that I don't. But I think I'm getting a little sidetracked. Point was that I still like teaching through experience, and even like you said, it's not that it's against the person or anything, but I think when they learn through that experience and you're not doing it, like I don't always do it from trying to prove my own point, but whenever you do teach them to go through the experience and kind of learn it for themselves, it's not that I like an I told you so moment. It's more of a self moment. Yeah, it's more of a self-realization moment, like, oh, now I understand what so-and-so was trying to tell me, but maybe I wasn't choosing the right words in to tell you, but now through your own experience, you've realized that, like, oh, and that definitely sticks way more than anything you try to drill in from anywhere else. All right. And the next one is hope. And this one we kind of had already a slight discussion. We were listening to it in the car. And it was pretty much wanting something that cannot be had in this world. It says this: we get teasers in this world, but I guess we don't get the full hope in this stage of our Christian life, I guess.
Is this a section where he's talking about heaven?
Kind of, yeah.
Like harps and like, why do I want to be up there playing a harp or whatever? And he's like, no, it actually isn't tied to music.
I didn't even bookmark that part because I had remembered this part. And I think he goes on to explain how heaven is explained in a way to us, in a way that we may understand it based on our current experiences. So he goes on to say like, oh, there'll be like this nice music, like harp music and
gold because it doesn't rust. And
yeah. And so all these other still very earthly things that we know have great value to us.
But it's just supposed to be the feeling of it.
Correct. So it's not, and he's explained this before. He's like, how I can give you the picture of how, or a simplified version of the picture of how something works, but that is not how that something works is. And so that's another really big misconception, I think, as to how people think heaven works. And it's not going to be, I guess, how they have it painted in pictures. Those pictures are to help us understand, but that's not, nobody knows. Nobody can go and then come back and say that's what it is.
Yeah, sort of, right? Because that's what the cool thing about this book is that he's like, that's what we think, but we don't actually know. So we could die and there could be like harps and angels and gold and whatever. But for now, it's understanding that is going to be the feeling that you get if there, and this is my interpretation, right? It's not from the book. If you do get to heaven, instead of hell, that is the feelings that you will possess rather than actually seeing those things. But you'll have those feelings of that. And that is heaven. Right? But yeah, so wanting something that you can't have in this world, like, and it's different for everybody.
And I think like one of those, one that I got told to myself was that how you do think of like reuniting with loved ones and stuff. And I think that's a big misconception too. And the way this was described to me was that think of it as just like your different stages in life. Like when you were a young kid, you had whatever your stage was, and you had a happy childhood or whatever. And then you move on to another one. It's like you kind of remember you do remember the past life, but now that you're in your new life, like a lot of times you probably wouldn't just go back to that one. And so you kind of set it up as stages that even like as you get married and create your own family or whatever, like as you keep growing up, that it's just a different stage now. So whatever you had before, you might have a glimpse of, but it's not what it is then. And so again, that's another one just to help us understand of those feelings that we would get from reuniting with loved ones, but it's probably not going to be that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That part was actually very clarifying and difficult for me. I had asked I had asked you about this before when my mom had passed away, and you had already read this book like 2 times. And I was like, so is there a heaven? And you're like, well...
No, there's no way.
And then it was already after. Or maybe you had already processed it, and I was just like having a hard time with dealing with her death.
I didn't read this for the first time probably till in 2020, I think.
Well, I don't know, but it was something that I had asked you. I guess I was contemplating my faith. I don't know. And I had asked you about it because you had already read it. For sure you had already read it. And you're like, I was like, is there a heaven? And you're like, well, maybe. I'm like, okay, well, that's the same thing, I think. Well, am I going to be reunited? And you're like, well, sort of, but not really. And I was like, sounds like bullshit. Like, this is supposed to have the answers. Where are the answers? And then reading this or listening to it the other day, I was kind of like, I was sort of dumbfounded. I still sort of am. Because, like, those feelings of love and care from a good, positive relationship, like, you always love to feel, not always, okay. For me, I always love to feel those. Like, the hug of a mom or whatever, But then, so knowing that you'll have that feeling is like, oh, yay. But then knowing that it's not that person or whatever, I was kind of like, well, that sucks.
But yeah. And I think that's still our earth brain talking, like... Of
course, and it has to be your earth brain because this is the only brain we have.
It's the only thing we know. Like, there's nothing else.
It's the same thing of not knowing darkness if you didn't know it. Like, you just don't know. You don't have another brain. Correct. Like, you can unleash those senses or whatever, right? And you can feel and whatever. Like, I'm not going to discard those feelings, right? Of like your sixth senses and being empathetic, and like so many people have different ways of expressing and feeling. I'm not trying to demean any of those, but at the same time, my brain doesn't always know that, right? Like, how do I know that I'm just not making that up?
Right.
Because sometimes you do make it up to make yourself feel good. It's like petting your own brain, And
I guess that's also the harder part for the human experience. Whenever people do talk about spirituality or all this other stuff, is that it's still just such our human brain. Like, I really, after reading it several times, I feel like it's convinced me that the whole spiritual part and scientific side are just on two different planes. It's not even the same thing. So even for somebody to say that, I had a dream about this, and it was a dream or whatever of God telling me this or whatever, that's
scientific.
Yeah, it's still a natural part of your brain, and the spiritual part can't overlap through this sense. So it's hard to believe, at least as the human side. Like, now, could it mean something? Maybe, but it might not be still the something that you think it means, I guess, if that makes sense.
I understand it. I'm not sure if our listeners do.
And again, like, even with this whole discussion, is the whole heaven thing is like, I tried to explain it to you then, you didn't understand it, and it wasn't until you experienced it yourself of reading the book. Like, there's no
because
way
you're not using the same words.
Yeah,
and it's a different time in life.
Yeah,
you're not in crisis mode. When you're in crisis mode, your brain cannot understand.
Yeah,
it's looking for some kind of pet. It's like, okay, it's okay, you're gonna be okay. That's what it's looking for, right? It doesn't want this that's why it has to be practiced. That's the whole point of this book also, is that yes, you can have all of these things, but at that point, like when the final day comes or whatever, this is what the book is saying, guys, not me reflecting back on it. When that final day comes, it will be too late.
Yeah.
You have to have all of these things in practice. That way you're so practiced that it's your nature. That's the person that you are. That is the spirit, for lack of a better term, that
Yeah.
you are. And if not, you're going to be made that.
Yeah, and I think he had mentioned that before, like to think of ourselves as like a, I don't know if we mentioned it.
You said a vessel.
No, but I was going to say, when I told you about the statue, that we're all like a block, a blank canvas, and each action we do is chipping away at it, creating us into some sort of creature or whatever. Now, in the end, did you come out as more of an angelic creature or a good creature, or a more devilish creature based on your actions? And I thought that was super cool analogy, that like all these little things are chipping away, literally shaping you as to what you are becoming. And yeah, I guess in the end we will see what we have become. But like you said, but what you said about practice is very fascinating too, because it is also like he had mentioned the music notes, doing how it's not just action, like this action is correct all the time and this action is incorrect all the time, but it was like music notes on a paper. This note will be correct in some points, and this note on the piano will be incorrect at other points. It's this note was not written in this music, so it's incorrect right now, and this note is written in the music, so this one's correct right now. And so the thing of practice is still like a musician. You can I've had this too, being a music teacher, is where you've practiced something wrong. And so I think that's also important with this whole thing too, is it's not just practicing it, it's practicing it correctly. Because if you practice it wrong, then you have to unlearn the stuff, and it's, you know how hard it is for us to unlearn anything. We're like, oh no, this is already the way I've been doing it. So like, it doesn't matter if you've been doing it this way, it's still incorrect or inefficient or whatever you want to call it, like any of those things.
That's where I think mindfulness comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to be mindful of the situations that you're encountering. That way you can choose. You have to make a conscious decision.
Correct. And not being on
of your actions.
Not being on autopilot and always just kind of doing the same thing just because it's
right. Well, because it might not be right. It might not be the right action for that moment. It's important to be thoughtful.
All right. And if we move on, the last one, or at least in this book, was faith, and this one had its fascinating moments too. He goes on to point out how we like to think we're creatures of reason and that we're governed by reason, but we're really not. So even if he gave the example of a surgeon and a surgery, like you already know how all this stuff works, that you know what a surgeon, you trust a surgeon to know that what he's doing, and he's done it so many times, and you know what the anesthetic does, and so on. All these pieces that come into play, and you know how it works. But now let's say you're the one going under the knife, you're the one going under surgery. Then you start thinking all these irrational thoughts that have nothing to do with reason, like, oh, what if the anesthetic doesn't work, or what if
they start the surgery before it kicks in.
Yeah. And so he kind of goes on to show that we are not as governed by reason as we think, but it should still be a thing of I guess that's how faith comes in. Now I had read another book called A Manual for Creating Atheists, and in that one whenever he would talk to people saying that this was faith, and he was very quick to say that faith is trust. And so there was a certain form of faith that and I honestly don't remember, but I do remember him comparing faith to trust. And I think this is one of those points that you should trust the doctor, you should trust the anesthetic, you should trust that all these things are working as they should. But it's not quite faith. And I think faith is one of those words that still, and I haven't quite gotten it clear from this book entirely, but he did mention why, and I'll go into it in a little bit. But faith does have a lot of meanings, different meanings in Christianity that people just throw around, and I don't think quite to mean the same thing. Like when you do trust something, it is to trust it, but then I can't remember other scenarios where you would use the word faith, but it doesn't mean trust anymore. It means something else, and so it's hard to narrow down what the word faith means in Christianity. And I think that is one of those. Let's continue and see if we'll get to that part. So the next part he was talking about was resistance. And I loved this quote because it was saying something that, like, someone who doesn't resist, if you're quick to not resist something, so let's say like an easier one for all of us, like you're trying to be good at what you're eating and you've been off of sweets or whatever, you already know what the feeling of caving in is like, but you're never going to know the outcome of what it would have been an hour later had you resisted. And you already know the feeling of what it is to cave into it, but now you don't know what it's like to have resisted an hour later, or now even a week later, or a month later, or so on and so on. And so I thought that was a very well said, I guess, way he put it. That that's another unknown that shows achievement, but it's not easy, and it's easy to cave in. But did you in the end get the same satisfaction, I guess? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And that's making me think of like it in a scientific term, right? Mm-hmm. So like when you do like a detox of like a social media detox and stuff, and so you understand what it's like to cave in, and you're like, yeah, right, because it's an actual physical thing that occurs in your brain. And then when you do resist it, like, I wonder, this is just a thought, is like, I wonder if your brain is searching for something else to replace it, right? So typically, like with smoking, you can't just cut the habit. You become dependent on something else, right? So if you're replacing your sugar, and you're like, okay, I'm not going to have processed sugars, I'm not going to have this, I'm not going to have that, and you're going good, and then you have a donut, right? Like, what gives your brain that exact dopamine and serotonin flush, like rush, when you do wait? So you do resist, but then you find something else to fill that void. And I'm wondering, like, what kind of...
And to me, I think it's not even so much that is what gives you the... Well, it does give you the dopamine hit, but I think it's more of the learned behavior and not wanting to unlearn the behavior. Because I think you could find something else that does it, but you already know this one works. You already know how it works. And to find another one, you don't know how good it'll work, and you don't know how quickly it'll work and all these things. And so you don't want to unlearn the previous one to replace it with the new one.
Right. No, your brain is constantly searching for it.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how that like ties into this, like what exactly happens with the resistance of it. Honestly, I've pretty much always given into something, so I don't know what it's like to, I know how long I can resist something, right? But then like once you do give into it, then also it's like working yourself up over nothing, and then you get it again and you're just like, it wasn't that good, but it wasn't worth waiting. I don't know. There's so many little like different scenarios, I guess. Again, it's all ups and downs and different scenarios with that. I can't exactly pinpoint anything. We're going to have to keep on going.
So the part I was coming in now, it came up is how faith is complicated, and it was mentioning that I was mentioning how faith has a bunch of different meanings in Christianity, and so the best understanding I took from it is that he says it is complicated, and you might not understand it now, but you could understand it later. It could be possibly years, or it could be just a little bit down the line, or whatever it is, but there will come a time, especially the more you do it, the more you learn from it. And that's understandable. I can understand that from like anything you're learning. Like there might be some things that are way too over your head right now. Don't worry about those. Just build your way up through all these other skills first. And then eventually one day you will understand. And I can accept that answer because it still applies to so many other things that we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds a little mind effy though. Because yes, it is complicated. And what if you had faith and then lost it?
Yeah.
And why did you lose it?
That one.
And do you work it back up? Is that what is supposed to happen? Like, so says the book, right? But what is the point of having it if it wasn't good enough? Or like, do you know what I mean? I think that there are many questions that can be posed for that.
Even like you said, like maybe all the pieces of the puzzle weren't in place yet. So like how I tried to tell you about this earlier, you were asking me about it, about heaven like years ago. And then now like it didn't make sense to you then because you were in a different stage of life. That puzzle piece wasn't there. That mentality wasn't there. So now that it's in a better place, now it makes a little more sense. And
but so just because it makes sense doesn't mean that it's still like a trusted thing, a trusted thought, I guess a thought.
I don't understand.
So just because I understand what heaven, quote unquote heaven is it still valid? Like I understand what it is, but okay, and does it give Veronica 3 years ago that peace of mind? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, a little more, but no. But also, it's still the same thing because it wasn't in the right place. So it wasn't gonna give you peace of mind because that peace wasn't in place.
Right,
it's
and now would it give me peace of mind?
I don't know. You tell me. I would still think of it like the pieces of like all the gears to a clock or something. Like if it's missing one of the thingies, then that piece isn't there. So of course the whole thing isn't going to work yet until all the pieces are there.
Okay.
So the other one I didn't quite understand, and that one maybe also because I'm not at that point yet, is the whole leaving it to God and trust God. And that for sure is a very pet peeve of mine when people say it like that, because it does sound very like take the wheel, Jesus, and it's like you're like, and I'm confusing with the Buddhist part because the Buddhist parts, and I don't know if that's where it overlaps, but in Buddhism it's acceptance versus resignation, and acceptance is pretty much accepting the cards you got. Like there's nothing you can do about the cards you got. These are this is the card you were dealt. These are the cards you were dealt. Do with it what you can. And with resignation is almost like you're refusing to play the game at all. And so that's what sometimes leave it to God feels like well, there's nothing I can do about it. Like it's in God's hand now. And I can see the similarities between the Buddhist perspective and this, but I feel like in Buddhism it still feels more like I can still do a little bit about it. I'm still taking some responsibility for it. And in the Christian sense, it feels like I'm not taking any responsibility for this. Like this is out of my league now. God, you take care of it. And that is very frustrating to me.
Do you think though, I agree. I do. But I'm wondering if all of these other things, all of the virtues, all of these rules that have been put in place are quote unquote leaving it to God. So still like you're leaving it to God, but you have to follow all of these things and maybe you'll get there.
Yes.
Is that what they mean?
I do. But my other pet peeve with it is that how many of the people that are using this phrase actually understand that versus just saying it, oh, I'm leaving it to God, and then just kind of let go of the wheel and like, oh, if I'm meant to not crash, then God's gonna take the wheel and I'm not gonna crash. And that's the part that annoys me, is that
It's so
you're still
blind.
using it wrong. Like I understand the intention maybe, but all these previous things we've talked about, do you have those in place that you are actually using the phrase correctly? And that just that whole kind of resignation where you're just kind of quitting and like, well, I don't know. It's not.
I think you're gonna have to finish this one up. I have to go.
Okay. Well, there's only two more. If we
Okay,
have to
go,
do it.
go, go, go. I have work, guys. Sorry.
Oh, one of the ones it mentions was kind of that is if you want, you can't just do whatever you want and expect to be forgiven. He's like, it is your responsibility to not ignore, and that's one of those things like, oh, well, so if like Hitler just wished everything away at the end and said he was like, was he going to be forgiven? It's like, kind of not. Like if he knew all this stuff beforehand, like if he's learning this on his deathbed that you can do this, and and he would to be truly sorry for everything he's done, yeah, then maybe. But if he already knew a lot of this stuff beforehand and didn't look deeper into it himself, then it appears that it's like, no, like you knew this was your responsibility to look more through it and you didn't, so that's kind of on your own choice, your own free will. And next one is, human language cannot separate what a human does versus what God does through you. So meaning that the stuff that God does through us, like when we're asking for God for help, like there's no way of separating. So if me and you did a task together, like we're gonna cook something, you can say, oh, I cooked this, he cooked that. But when you do something through God, there's no way of separating like what God did and what you did. It's just one of those things, again, you have to learn through understanding. Does that make sense?
Yep, I have a big pet peeve with that.
Why is that?
Because well, I sort of an understanding and sort of a peeve with it. Some of the work that I've done, like, oh, I guess it could be going back to God. Like it could have given him or them all of the, I wouldn't have learned if it weren't for them, for God, right? But then at the same time, like, is God working through you? But then in some people's minds are like, oh, thank God. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, so you just disregarded all of the time I spent with your loved one doing all of this other stuff? Or are you saying like, thank you to me also?
I guess it's their mentality that if they're of Christian belief, that they already know that God is working through you, and so it's just one of those.
I don't know about that though.
Yeah.
Right? You don't know what another person does. Sorry guys, I really have to go. Bye.
All right.